I like that song. You caught me surprised with just the one verse. I was standing in the back and I saw end of song. Oh, that's really pretty. We're glad that you're here tonight. It is so wonderful to come into this parking lot and just see cars all over. People here, you drive around town getting here and there's a lot of empty places. Most businesses are closed. Most church buildings aren't meeting in the evenings. Maybe they weren't meeting in the morning. And yet you get to this area and pretty much all the cars, you have to be careful in Lindale on Sunday night on the roads, because pretty much every car you see around you is a member of the Lindale Church trying to get there. So you don't want to get up too close on them. I noticed on Highway 849, like 5 of us cars in a row all pulled in together. And it's just a really wonderful feeling to see people who've driven quite a distance. We have members who drive 45 minutes to an hour every service just to be here, to be with Christians doing the things that matter most. We talk a lot about worship. You hear me talk about the importance of worship maybe every week. Worship is not everything. Coming to a church building and being with God's people, that's not the end-all, be-all. I wouldn't call it the end-all. I would call it the beginning of all. We start every week in the presence of believers, memorializing our Son, praising His name, and studying things that can help us. And then we go out and we live the week. And then next Sunday, how will we begin again? We'll do it together. And then midweek, if the Lord is willing, we get to encourage each other. Just so wonderful. Thankful for the plan and for our eldership. Aren't you, 8 men are going to go like this when I say this. Aren't you glad you're not a shepherd? Like, how hard do you think that job is to try to negotiate all of what's going on and come up with a plan and represent people? Elders in the Old Testament in particular were representatives of the people. They not only made decisions, they made decisions that reflected the faith and will of the people. And that's what our elders do. So we're very thankful for that. We pray for the next month as we move into the gospel meeting that we can get things going. Okay, tonight for just a little bit, we're going to do a character study. I noticed in preaching anyway, I haven't done a whole lot of character studies in the last couple of years. Reagan McClenny and I sat in 2 chairs up here last summer. We did a whole bunch of them. Not the one tonight, but there's a particular person of interest for us for the next little bit. It is a man from the Old Testament in the days of the Israelites, a military man of whom God said something quite wonderful. There is nowhere else in Scripture where God said anything quite like this about any one person. He said he has a different spirit. And he goes on to clarify what he means. He has followed me fully. This person was unique to all of the different people around him. When God said he had a different spirit, he didn't mean a spirit that was different from the heathens in the world. That wouldn't be difficult. He meant even among my own people, there's something special about this guy. When God says something like that about someone, I want to learn about that person. I want to try to find out what God loved so much about him, because I can think of few things that I would be more interested in having God say when he sees me face to face as to say that you, sir, have a different spirit and you followed me fully. So that's a bit of a hint because that's a direct quote. Who has an idea of which character we'll be studying tonight? Any ideas so far? You can nod if you think you might know. Let me give you a couple more hints before we jump right in. My name is Christopher Emerson with a K. I was born in 1978. At the time, my parents, maybe not faithfully going to church, I wasn't there to tell the exact story, but they chose to name me after a country singer. Kris. Oh, he was a military man, but your first hint is this is not about Christopher Christopherson tonight, not the man God was referencing. By 1982, my parents had another son, and they were going to church and getting all Bible-y, so they named him Joshua. Joshua was a great guy. He has a whole book named after him about the conquest of the land of Canaan. That was a great choice for a son's name, but God did not say this even about him. 1985, my parents had a third son. I think maybe it's in the rule book. If you have a son named Joshua, and then you get another son, you name him Caleb. And Caleb became my younger brother, and the 3 of us grew up together in the church serving God. But it was Caleb of whom God said, your spirit is different than any of those around you. And what I want to do tonight, if you'll go with me to Numbers 13, is I just want to dig in a little bit on what was going on with this particular person. Give you a couple of things to think about. As you'll see by the end, there are 2 particular age ranges that I'll be talking to tonight. You'll see that come together before we're done. If you fit into either one of these age ranges, then this certainly is a lesson for you. But let's get the story. If you're in Numbers 13, you'll note firstly the quote. Let's make sure you see that on the page. Numbers 14:24 is where God said, Numbers 14:24, my servant Caleb, because he had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring him into the land which that he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. So God rewarded him because there was something unique about his character. Okay, who remembers this story? Maybe we all do. I thought maybe some of our younger students tonight would enjoy going back through the 12 spies whom God sent in to scout the land of Canaan early on in the book of Numbers. And in chapter 13 and verse 1, let's look at just a few of the highlights of the story. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send out for yourself men, so that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of their fathers' tribes, every one a leader among them. So God said, the land is yours. I just want you to send 12 guys to go check it out. In verse 6, we learn that one of those guys is Caleb. And in verse 16, we learn that another one of those guys is Joshua. Now, as you move to verse 27, chapter 13 and verse 27, thus they told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us. And it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And he talks about how big they were. So here's what happened. The 12 spies come back, and they all report it's exactly as God said it was going to be. We've been waiting generations for this. But they also reported, and 10 of them in particular reported, that the cities were too heavily fortified, Jericho and its wall. And the people there were enormous, strong, monstrous people, and we cannot take the land. And it was Caleb, in verse 30, who quieted the people in their despair and said the following. Numbers chapter 13, verse 30. Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome. That's Caleb for you. He's a man who understands the promises of God. He understands the size of the adversary, and he said, by all means, we should do this. Unfortunately, however, his voice did not sway the rest. In verse 31, the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we had gone and spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size, these Nephilim that we talk about sometimes. So it seems like they even tainted their message to the Jews. They downplayed the milk and the honey, and they upsized the adversaries to try to talk the people out of it. And so what would they do? Would they listen to we love these stories where one great leader stands up against all who oppose what is right, and he leads them to victory. Is that this story? It's not. Chapter 14, verse 1. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. All the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in the wilderness. And so there you have it. More complaining, more cowardice among them. Chapter 14 and verse 6. Look with me. Chapter 14 and verse 6. Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, of those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. This is chapter 14, verse 7. And they spoke to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into the land, and he will give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only, and you can almost hear them pleading, do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. But all the congregation said, to stone them with stones. Then the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel. Well, there's a lot of that going around, isn't there, in the Bible? Fear, a lack of belief in the power of God, and anger, and even rock throwing. at anyone who suggests that you stop being a coward and you do what God said. Never been popular, never will be popular. Joshua and Caleb suffered at the hands of this, and so God was very angry. Let's finish the story. Look in chapter 14 and verse 28. Say to them, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. Look in Numbers 14:29. Your corpses will fall in this wilderness, even all your numbered men, according to your complete number from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, he says. Verse 30, surely you shall not come into the land in which I swore to settle you, except Caleb and Joshua. He said it again in verse 38, Joshua and Caleb remained alive out of those men who went to spy out the land. And there's your story. You may remember some of the numbers. They numbered the soldiers at the beginning of the book of Numbers, and they numbered the soldiers again at the end. Anybody remember how many soldiers there were? There were 603,550 soldiers. That's a lot of guys. 2 of them stood up and said, let's do what God said. Let's not worry about the adversary. As a result of 10 men who stood against them, 603,548 soldiers were buried in the ground over the course of about 38 years. I've told you guys this before. That's 40 holes in the ground every day for 38 years. Can you imagine that? Could you imagine a community burying 40 men a day? This is a lot like Jonah. If you can't do what I've asked you to do, and you don't believe that I can deliver you, then you cannot escape me. The power I would have used for you now will be used against you. And it was, except for Joshua and Caleb. So I want to make a few observations on the left from the story in Numbers 13 and see if you can figure out some application. I didn't do a lot of application tonight. I wanted you to think about it a little bit. But here's some things to consider. You'll learn about this more in just a bit. But when Caleb and Joshua and these men were selected to go, they were in what we would call the prime of life. Caleb was 40 years old. I consider that to be just prime. That's, I passed it by a little bit. But 40 years of age, you get this guy, he's probably got a family and all this, and you send him in, and you take a man at the peak of his strength. 40. You know, 40's great. I think 40's great. I've only experienced everything under it so far. But you know, at 40, you're a lot wiser than you were as a young person, and yet you still have the strength that you won't have later. You're kind of at a nice place. That's why we call it the prime of life, 30 to 50 years old. And in that moment, he was called by his strength and in his prime to lead the people. And one thing you can say about Caleb is if God promised it, it was so. I sure wish that was something God could say about all of us. If God said it, then it's so. And nothing can be said against it. Really quickly look back at the beginning of the story. In chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, the Lord said to Moses, I am going to give you the land. Now send some guys to go take a look at it and plan an attack. And you know, even though it didn't happen here, ultimately God did give them the land because when God says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And Caleb was a guy who pled with him. You can see he and Joshua like tearing his clothes going, listen, wait, God said he's with us. If God said he's with us, what could possibly be against us? That's Romans 8, isn't it? If God is with us, who could be against us? He was a man who was confident in God's promises, and he was strong in his convictions. In chapter 13 again, and around verse 30, he quieted the people. And I love the language. Let me read it to you again. We shall by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. What I like about verse 30 is he's not talking about God now. He's saying God told us to go. God told us we would have it. God is on our side. But listen, folks, we've got to get up. We've got to go and take it. We have work to do. It reminds me of James 2 and faith without works. People like, I'll believe in God's promises, but when it's time to go do the thing, someone else will have to do it. Someone else did do it after that whole generation died. Someone else did do it. So what I like about him is he's saying, I'm strong, we're strong, let's get to work. And yet with all of that, he was a total failure. That's just sad. Caleb, Joshua, what a team those two were. He's got everything right, you know. You're confident in God, you're ready to work. I mean, what else do you need if you're confident in God and you're ready to work? And yet with all the pleading in the world, he was unable to lead faithless people. I want to say that again. The strongest and most valiant warriors in the world and in the faith cannot lead a faithless people. And they couldn't do that. And they were unable to take it alone. It reminds me, and maybe we'll reference a little bit of this in a few minutes when we close the lesson, but Caleb's story reminds me a little bit of the Apostle Paul's story. When you read in 2 Timothy, in 2 Timothy, he's near the end of his life, and he writes in chapter 1, 2 Timothy 1, he said, there was a point where there was no one with me, where everyone had deserted me. And he names a couple of his ex-friends, I guess, people who just totally desert him. Demas deserts him. Paul was a guy who wanted to do a lot of great things, but there weren't always the people around him who would do it. But even though you may count Joshua and Caleb's efforts a failure, they were remembered by God. Even as Caleb was unable to rally them, and even as God was leveling out these unprecedented judgments against his own people, don't miss that. We find in Numbers 14, again, in Numbers 14, beginning in verse 26, when God starts going through all of this, and in verse 29, he says, your corpses will fall in the wilderness, all the numbered men, verse 29. But again, in verse 30 and in verse 37 and 38, he says, except Joshua and Caleb. Caleb, verse 24, had a different spirit. Numbers 14, 24, he followed me fully, even if you wouldn't go with him. Even if he couldn't fulfill his primary objective in his heart, in his spirit, he was a man who followed me fully. I will bring him, verse 24, into the land in which he has entered, and his descendants will take possession of it. So what do you think? If this was something you were reading with your kids at the dinner table, or having a study with our young people, or a ladies' class tomorrow morning, and you were working your way through, what would be the application of Caleb's story? You say, well, I want to be like him. I want God to say that about my spirit. I do too. So what do we learn from this that can help us with that? Let me give you just a few really quick things. I don't have them on the board. Number one, I really can't get past this prime of life business. I can almost imagine it. These 12 spies come back. Maybe they're all around 40 years of age. They're as strong as they've ever been. They're as smart as they've ever been. But they have a lot going on. They're busy. They have families. They have children. They don't want to die and leave them alone. They have all these prime of life. Is anybody familiar with prime of life pressures? Where you're at like you're most capable, but you have so much happening or so much responsibility or so much to lose. That's the thing about prime of life. At prime of life, you've got things to lose. You could lose your family. You could lose all the money you've been saving. Everything could go away. One of the things that occurs to me is that God called him in his prime moments. And, I was thinking of other stories like that too. Moses was 40 years old when God said, perfect. You're right there in that middle ground. You still have strength and you have quite a bit of wisdom. Go. Jesus was 30 years old. There's this strong presence. And one of the applications is I want to speak to our prime of lifers. Got any prime of lifers in the room? I'm looking around now. Who are our prime of life people? I'm talking about young adults, 30s, 40s. Maybe I'll stretch it a little bit to bring more smiles to your faces, 25 to 55. You're strong. You're wise. You got a lot going on, but you're strong and you're wise and you're capable and you have resources. And when it comes to the work of God in the church, it's time to step out and lead. It's time to lead your peers. It's time to lead our young people. It's time to talk about how confident you are in the promises of God. It's time to talk about how we can use our strength. There is nothing more sad in the church than to see men and women of that perfect age to work, not working, hiding, or carrying on with other things. One of the things that I drew from this story is I'm at an age where God usually calls people to say, now. Now's the time. God's people need you and we have work to do. And I would say there are quite a few people looking at me right now who fit into that category. But I think a second point you can make here is that he still wasn't expected to do it by himself. It was important to try to rally others to it. It is always important that we do our best work when we do it together. Do you guys understand that? When we worship together, when we support one another, when we believe together. Preachers often lament in other churches and places where they preach how draining it is to be a preacher in your dead-on prime of life with your beautiful family, wasting away at a church where everybody your age is out making quadruple your salary or traveling all around the world or involved in every ilk of thing, and they don't want to work. They show up at church, they go home, wears them out. But it's not just true of preachers. But the message that we learn here is, prime of lifers, it's time to get to work. But we have to do it together if we want to carry out the things of God. But even if you are one of those preachers or elders who labored and people would not labor with you, even if you are one of those families that tried to influence the young people or tried to pull people together or tried to get something going and it just didn't work. Nobody else had the faith that you had. There is some good news in this as well, isn't there? That God will remember you. God remembered Caleb even in the years when no one followed him. God remembered Moses when Moses thought that everybody was going to love him because he was here to deliver them and they chased him out of the city. For 40 years he was gone. So those are three things that come to me. Prime of lifers, let's kick going. We need to work together on this and get on the same page and be a powerful force as one. And even if you fail, you will not fail God and God will not fail you. But he may see a different spirit. Now, if this was the end of Caleb's journey, I think it would give us, it'd be a little bit depressing, but I think it would give us a few things to think about. But how many of you know that this is not the end of Caleb's story? This is really where it gets good. How many of you know that this 40-year-old man kind of just hunkers his shoulders over and walks through the wilderness for 40 years watching all of his friends die, except for Joshua, and then they get years later? Would you go with me to Joshua chapter 14? Did you know there's more? I love this. First half of our study was for the prime of lifers. Now we want to talk about a different group. Do you know how many years have passed by the time we hear Caleb's name again? Let's read it together and you'll see it for yourself on the page. Are you in Joshua, chapter 14? Let's pick up in verse 10. Joshua 14, verse 10. Then the sons of Judah drew near to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb said to him, "You know the word which the Lord spoke to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought word back to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless," Joshua 14:8, "my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt with fear, but I followed the Lord my God fully. So Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot has trodden will be an inheritance to you and to your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God fully." Now look at verse 10. "Now behold, the Lord has let me live, just as he spoke these 45 years from the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses when Israel walked in the wilderness. And now behold, I am 85 years old." It's his birthday, it looks like. Today, he said, I'm 85 years old. Maybe not his birthday, but that's how old he was. So when we pick up in the book of Joshua, we're talking about a guy who has lived over double as many years as when he would have been considered a prime spy and soldier and leader. And you might be thinking, as I get into this last bit of points, you might be thinking, well, back then they lived to be 300 or 400 or 500, so 85 was not that big a deal. That's not the case. Did you know that? By the time we get to the period of Joshua and Aaron and Moses, they were dying around the age of 100, maybe 110, not that much different. So at the very least, if I stretch this out to make everybody feel better, at the very least, when we're talking about Caleb at 85, we're talking about members of the church in their 70s, at least. Maybe late 70s into their 80s. You know what we sometimes see in the church? With men in particular, in their 70s and in their 80s. We see a lot of stepping back, letting the younger generation do the work. Now, there's still a lot of spiritual strength with older people, and that gray hair that they bring, the Bible talks about, and that wisdom, here's my point, it's super influential. They're the most powerful people in the room, and a lot of them don't know it. Well, that's who we're looking at here, an older guy, but he's too old to do anything, right? I mean, he's 85. He'll have to say, well, I'll sit back in my chair and call out commands, right? No. His confidence never ceased. He went through very difficult times. Could you imagine 40 years in the wilderness with that many deaths? He went through a very difficult time where he's getting older and older, and he knows he's not going to live very much longer. And yet what we learn in the passages we just read in verse 9 and 10, he said, Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot is trodden will be an inheritance to you. God, let me live so that God could fulfill his promises. Would to God that all of us, as we grow older through those prime ages into those later and last years, wouldn't to God that our confidence in his promises would never fail and be just as secure as they've ever been. His strength is, I think, the most impressive part. Look in verses 11 and 12. 85 years old, this guy. He said, I am still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. Now, I got to pause there for a minute. I mean, you think so? He's 85. What do you think the other 40-year-old soldiers thought when he said that? Like, no, you're not. He's 85. How could he possibly be that strong? He said, no, listen carefully. As my strength was then, so my strength is now for war, for going out, and for coming in. Now then, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke on that day, for you heard on that day that Anakim were there with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out as the Lord has spoken. He was strong, wasn't he? He was courageous and bold in his language. And he didn't say, I'm going to sit back and y'all go get that for me. He led them even at that age. But here's something really cool about it. Even though he's now 85 years old, near the end of his life, the people around him have changed. I really want you to take this thought home tonight. He's still the same guy. He's older. He's wiser. The wisdom has gone up. I would say the strength has gone down. He would look me in the face and say, you're wrong about that. But I would say probably the physical strength has gone down. But what's the same is a man who's ready to work and who believes in what God has told us to do. What has changed are the people. There's a whole new generation of soldiers now, a different people. He was able to lead faithful men. He was successful with these people. Joshua, the whole first half there of the book of Joshua, is the conquest of the land of Canaan, which took them 7 years to do. He was about 5 years in when he called up Caleb and said, all right, you want that land God promised you? Caleb said, let's go. And he led the soldiers, and they received it because God never forgot. God never forgot the integrity and the promise he made to Caleb, and Caleb never forgot what God told him would be so. Let's just finish the chapter. Joshua 14, verse 12. Now then, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day that and the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out as the Lord has spoken. So Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. Therefore, Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kizanite, until this day, because he followed the Lord God of Israel fully. Now, the name of Hebron, and he goes on to talk about that. You know what occurs to me about the word fully? I've been thinking about this. They said that when he was 40 years old, it said, it's a different spirit, follow me fully. At 85 years old, it said it again. You know, I start to realize that fully has two different dimensions to it. Does this make sense to you? When we say follow God fully, what we usually mean is fully, like this, like do all of, like don't give up. Don't stop working. Keep all the commands of God. Don't end up being shallow, go deep. But you know what we also learned from Caleb's story is fully also worked what way? It wasn't just do all of what God said, it was do all of what God said for all of your life. If God calls on you at the age of 85, you get up and you gird your sword and you fight. And there was never a question in his mind. I want to talk for just a moment. Go to Titus 2. We'll finish this lesson. I want to talk just a moment about God's senior servants. Is that an okay term? I mean that in the most loving way when I say God's senior servants. I'm talking about members of the Lord's church who can't claim the prime years anymore. And by the way, who probably all have some pretty horrendous stories to tell. It's a sad thing about the church because we're imperfect and not all churches are working like they should. And if you know of a man or a woman who's in their 60s, 70s, or 80s in the church and you ask them about the history of the church, they're all going to be able to tell you these stories about how they tried and the people failed. Or they thought they would go to this church and make a big difference and then no difference got made. We all have these disappointing stories. So what? So what? Let it go. Because maybe you were the one who wanted to do the good work, and maybe everything fell apart, and maybe God kept you and changed out all the people around you. Would you look around just a moment, just a second, just a glance? Look around. God has built this place. God has accumulated these people. Within this group are prime of lifers like Brian and me. And then there are Bobs. Bob's got Caleb beat, even in our time. Elders like Joe. An environment of people that God has not forgotten. And what we need is for our senior servants to understand that what you couldn't do in your prime, you are now primed to do. You say, well, not now. I can't lead these young people now. I can't conduct these Bible studies. I can't be hospitable or evangelistic. I don't have the energy. Does that sound like Caleb? I don't have the energy anymore. Does that sound like Caleb to you? Because that was a man with a different spirit. He said, I'm as strong now as I've ever been. Show me the work. What we need are senior servants. What's interesting is I have a whole nother lesson called senior. I've never done it here. Senior servants. I think because I'm just slightly scared that I'll say citizens accidentally and ruin everything. But there are a lot of cases. Moses was 40, didn't get it done. God brought him back at what? 80. He did the work. There were those like Noah. Noah was in the last third. He was 600, but in a time when they lived to be 900, it wasn't until he would have been a man in his 60s or 70s that God called him to do the great work of building the boat. On and on and on again. God is priming older Christians to do their greatest work. Do you see that in yourself? Titus 2 stands out to me so much in verses 1 through 8. Let me just read verses 1 through 8 because you have the older there and the younger there. And I see, just to talk about the Lindale Church a moment and our work and what God's trying to do evangelistically and in developing our young people's faith and just everything we're here to do. I just see that God is developing these senior members, the older members who have so much respect. We respect them so much as the great leaders in the eldership and in other places that have way more influence than any single voice, any preacher, any time. Titus 2 and verse 1, but as for you, speak the things which are fitting for sound doctrine. Older men are to be temperate, dignified, sensible, sound in faith, in love, in perseverance. Older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips, not enslaved to much wine, teaching what is good, so that they may encourage the younger women to love their husbands and their children, to be sensible and pure and workers at home and kind and subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. And then I think verse 6 picks up with the older men again. Like, older men, here's your job. Likewise, older men urge the younger men. Urge them to be sensible in all things. Show yourself to be an example of good deeds with purity and doctrine, dignified, sound in speech, which is beyond reproach, so that the opponent will be put to shame, having nothing bad to say about us. A very sad reality is you might go up to someone who's been in the church a really long time and read this verse to them and say, we need you to help with these younger people. We need you to have them in your homes. We need you to conduct Bible studies with them. And again, it triggers, back in the early 90s, I tried to do that. We worked on that. And let me tell you, the parents just weren't on board. Or the kids weren't getting the right kind of training, or the elders didn't support what we did. Look, I'm not talking about people around you in the 90s. I'm still talking about you. Except this time, there's a different group of soldiers around you. Are you still ready to work? Because the work is ready for you. And God is still watching and remembering. And so when we look at Caleb, I'm going to ask, where are you in this story? Maybe our young people get a little bit of a free pass tonight. Not a lot, because let me tell you a little something. That prime of life thing, it comes kind of fast. I thought, I'll never be that old. And there's people looking at me right now going, this kid has no idea what he's talking about. That's the way it works. We just keep flowing from beginning to end. But you know what I know? Prime of life, last years, God still has work to do, and he still uses our hands to do it. Still us. Are you ready for that? We're going to do a lot of work this year. We get things back. We're getting back to that, quote, normal thing. We're going to be talking a lot about our work. And that's all hands on deck. And it doesn't matter how seasoned those hands are. Though the more seasoning they have, the more people may respect the work that they do. If you're someone who's felt like you've begun to retire from the work, if you're someone who's in the prime of life and that's why you haven't been plugged in, because there's so many things at risk, I encourage you to consider the moment when God said of Caleb, he has a different spirit, and I will bless him greatly. Because as I said at the beginning, I can think of nothing else I want God to say about me when he sees me one day face to face. He has a different spirit. I have remembered him. Come into the land which has been promised to you. If we can help you move forward in that way with the support of God's people, come